Joining us now in the group chat, retired Lieutenant General Karen Gibson, former Deputy Director of National Intelligence and a Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Strategies. General, it's good to have you here. So when we parse through what we're hearing, right, about these concerns that were raised by General Kane, about the military stockpiles in this moment, what does it tell you about the math here?
Well, I think at any time that you're using weapons faster than the industrial base can replenish them, then of course your stockpiles are going to diminish to some point. The question is it dangerous? You know, what kinds of shortages might we encounter? And it's important to remember that it's not just U.S. forces that use these expensive interceptors, but also our Gulf partners. You know, we provide similar kinds of capacity in the past in the Republic of Korea or to Ukraine. And so it can become a global supply problem if we are depleting them too rapidly. And each time that Iran launches missiles or one-way attack drones, it requires the expenditure of these scarce resources.
So to your point, right, about where else these munitions are being used, I want to play a little bit of what we touched on this briefly, but we have the sound now. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Mike Waltz, had to say about that specifically.
We inherited a difficult situation with many of our munitions having been given over in Ukraine, a lot of them expended in the Houthis, but we are rebuilding with cheaper, faster, more technologically capable as we are conducting this campaign.
Recognizing, you know, what has happened before, it does beg the question of, shouldn't that have been taken into account before going into this war, knowing that it could last longer?
Yeah, so I would say two things. One, I think the shortfalls in the defense industrial base have been long-standing. It's one of the 4 priorities of the new defense strategy is to rebuild that. But two, certainly I think the initial planning for this campaign did not anticipate that it would go this long.
We have heard from the president about how Iran's military capabilities have been depleted. What are you seeing?
Yeah, so they've been dramatically depleted, right? But not eliminated. And frankly, eliminating them is darn near impossible. You look at the very narrow Strait of Hormuz that we're trying to protect and the vast geography from which Iran can attack it with cheap, relatively easy to produce, easy to hide, one-way attack drones. And when I, as an intelligence professional, look at an enemy's, what they might do, I look at 2 things. One, what is their will and intent? And Iran has been very clear that they intend to control navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. And what is their ability to do so? And in terms of their ability to do so, we've degraded that considerably, but not eliminated it. And in terms of their will and intent, there's really no indications that we've moved the needle on that. They still insist that they will control the straits. And so I'm not sure, while it's been tactically effective and tactically we've degraded tremendous capabilities, we haven't achieved our strategic aims.
I just want to ask you one more question on that point. So Aaron David Miller over the weekend was talking on CNN. I spoke with him a little bit about this yesterday. Talking about, when you talk about the will, right, there's also the will of Iranian leadership to keep going and to be able to inflict pain on their own people. That is incredibly strong.
Oh, yes.
And is it proving to be more strong in this moment than you think was anticipated?
Well, I think some people underestimated the willingness, one, of the Islamic Republic or the men who are in charge to absorb pain. And the well-being of the Iranian people has never been a top priority. I think people also forget that for them, this is an existential fight for the survival of the state. And so their willingness and ability to absorb that kind of pain, whether it's in the form of punishing airstrikes or years-long sanctions regimes, is very high. They are not making the kind of calculations that a nation who put their economic likelihood as their top priority would make. You know, I think there were perhaps some assumptions that they won't choke off the strait because it'll hurt them economically. They won't attack Gulf states because they need them to remain neutral. And those are the kind of rational decisions that a nation that was economically minded might make. But when you're in an existential fight for the survival of the Islamic Republic, your calculus is different.
And in terms of the calculus, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but the fact that, and we heard from Senator Cassidy there, right, the fact that congressional funding, right, is going to plays an important role here. Sarah, how do you see all of this figuring in now in this moment as the American people, as we know from every poll that comes out, are increasingly dissatisfied with where things stand?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that Americans don't think about, but you know that military officials think about, strategic officials think about, is if we were to get into a situation where allies depended on us, let's say China were to invade Taiwan, and our stockpile is low. that is a very, very serious long-term national security issue for us. Now, I don't think that the American people are demanding answers to that of their politicians as we head into the midterms. What they are demanding answers on is the economic priorities that you just mentioned, and those things are going to be very, very seriously felt if we cannot figure out the stockpile issues. So, for example, if we cannot figure this out with the Strait, if the Strait doesn't remain open and we can't get free trade to go through, there's no way gas prices are going down ahead of the midterms. By the way, even if we got the Strait open, there's probably no way that they're going to go down in time for midterms. That's the biggest priority for voters right now. And if you're Congress, you don't want to be in a position where you're voting against funding in a way that it's going to come down to the way that it's hitting people's prices at the pump, in grocery stores, and all those things. So they've got some delicate dancing to do. But I do think that the bigger strategic concern is it's not actually about some of these short-term economic pains. It's what do we do if we have no stockpile, China invades Taiwan, our allies in the southeastern part of the world are dependent on us, that becomes a pretty serious problem.
Absolutely. I do also want to bring you on this next topic. So the mayor of New York wants him arrested. American support for Israel is shrinking. There is the war with Iran. In the midst of all of this, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is coming to the United States. On the docket, he has a meeting with President Trump in Washington tomorrow. This is going to be their first face-to-face since February, when the U.S. and Israel launched their joint attacks against Iran. The Prime Minister also here for the funeral and memorial services of Lindsey Graham. The senator, of course, was a vocal supporter of Israel, a vocal supporter of the war, and of Netanyahu, calling him one of his greatest friends. So when we look at where things stand, for Benjamin Netanyahu coming in now, there are a lot of questions about, we've seen the polling, right, based on Israeli policies about American support for continuing to support Israel, right, and when it comes financially as well. The ambitions of Israel, the ambitions for Benjamin Netanyahu, how significant of a blow is it without that very vocal support of Lindsey Graham as a hawk and as such a staunch supporter of Israel? How much weight do you think he actually held?
So Graham is one person in a chamber of 100, but he had a very unique position in that he was both an institutionalist, he was there for a long time, he had the trust of his colleagues, even some who were more Trump skeptical, plus he also was friends and had the trust of the president. And there are very few senators left in that role, plus he was also sort of a defense hawk and was, willing to, wanting to intervene in some of these countries. So he occupied this space that there's almost no one really to replace him going forward. You've seen some others, Ted Cruz, for example, has also been very vocal about wanting to, essentially finish the job in Iran and continue on a very strong support there. But this is going to be a voice that is lost. And, as we've seen, various factions of the party, strong voices, people like J.D. Vance who have said, look, we should pull back from this. This really, presents a potential pivot point for, just U.S. foreign policy globally of, does the U.S. decide to completely pull back on the foreign stage, both Iran, Ukraine, as well as potentially in the Caribbean, Venezuela, Cuba. There's a whole laundry list of things that the president has talked about that may shift depending at least on Capitol Hill where his party is.
How much do you think is riding on this meeting this week?
Well, meeting might be a strong term. We'll see what happens tomorrow, because it's unclear whether or not this is going to be an Oval Office meeting or is this going to be a poolside at the funeral. But it certainly is an opportunity for President Trump and Bibi Netanyahu to get back on the same page again. Right across the summer, we've seen various spats. The president has been very frustrated, to say the least, with Netanyahu at times. So certainly, putting aside Senator Graham and the funeral for a moment here, certainly it's a very important opportunity for Bibi Netanyahu to at least reclaim or at least get on the same page, with President Donald Trump over what the next steps in this are.
And when it comes to this relationship, right, and how important it is for both countries moving forward, how much of an impact has this war with Iran had on that relationship?
Well, I think, certainly we launched it together with a similar aim and a desire to have a dramatically diminished Iran, which does not have a nuclear capability. The contours of what that end state looks like may differ for us. It's important to remember that Iran Israel and our Gulf partners all live within range of Iranian proxies and missiles. The United States does not. And so there may be a concern, as Iran's strategy all along has been to make this so politically and economically untenable for us, that we back off on some of the concessions we're demanding. There could be concerns on the part of Israel and Gulf states that we come to an agreement with Iran that leaves dangerous capabilities that continue to threaten them.
There is also, just before I let you all go, the fact that Netanyahu is coming in a moment when in New York City, right? I don't live in New York City, but I work there, right? Here for the week in Washington, D.C., the backlash that Mayor Mamdani has been facing after his comments saying, yes, he would absolutely arrest Benjamin Netanyahu, then, oh, wait, I realize I can't do that. The backlash there has been, and specifically from Jewish New Yorkers who are saying, I don't feel safe in this city. Bibi Netanyahu talking about that, addressing it in interviews over the weekend. Is this an inflection point for the mayor this early in his term in terms of how he deals with this?
Absolutely. There is a huge Jewish population in New York City. One of the other sort of big problems with his rhetoric has been that Bibi Netanyahu represents, in a broader sense to Americans, sort of security in the Middle East, right? Israel is our only ally in the Middle East, and clearly the Trump administration has backed them and supports them with this new Saudi deal. That is a huge, huge, huge pressure point on some of the Iranian proxy groups now that we are showing, got Saudi to put their support behind Israel. I think for Mamdani, he has this good relationship with Donald Trump. And so I keep watching what becomes the breaking point to that. And I think that Bibi Netanyahu and the Israel issue could become a breaking point to that if he doesn't play his cards right.
Yeah, be interesting to see how that plays out. Appreciate it. Thank you all.